I survived the sinking of my ship and learned how to find food and water in the middle of the Atlantic. I thought those would be the hardest problems I would face. I was wrong. The hardest part came when ships began passing close enough for me to see them, but none of them could see me. I had always loved the sea. During the Second World War, I worked as a steward aboard a merchant ship carrying supplies across the Atlantic. I spent whatever time I could on deck, watching the clouds and trying to understand the currents. There was something comforting about knowing the ocean had patterns, even when I couldn't always read them. The torpedo changed that in seconds. I remember the explosion, men shouting, and the deck tilting beneath my feet. Then I was in the water, surrounded by debris, trying to reach a small raft before the ship disappeared beneath me. By sunrise, the shouting had stopped, and when I looked around, there was no sign of the ship or any of the men I had known aboard her. The sunrise should have made me feel better. Instead, it showed me how completely alone I was. Once the sun was high enough to see clearly, I took stock of what I had. The raft carried emergency water, tins of biscuits and preserved food, a flashlight, rope, a few signaling supplies, and some other equipment. Years of working as a steward had taught me to keep track of provisions, so counting everything came naturally. I divided the food into portions and decided how much water I could allow myself each day. I wasn't thinking about months. I assumed another ship would come through these waters soon. My job was simply to make what I had last until it did. The first few days were easier because I had things to do. I checked the supplies, watched the weather, kept the raft in order, and searched the horizon. Whenever clouds gathered, I thought about rain. Fresh water worried me more than food, because there was an entire ocean beneath me, and not a drop of it could help. I began using pieces of canvas to catch rain and guide it into the containers I had emptied. The first time it worked, I remember sitting there afterward, looking at the water I had collected. It wasn't much, but it meant I no longer had to depend entirely on what had been placed aboard the raft. Food took longer to solve. When the biscuits and preserved provisions began disappearing faster than I liked, I knew I needed another source. I had no fishing rod, so I started looking at the things around me differently, wondering what I could use and what I could take apart. There was metal inside the flashlight that I could shape into a hook, and the rope could be separated into thinner strands for a line. My first attempts caught nothing, and each failure cost me bait I couldn't afford to waste. I kept changing the hook and the way I lowered it into the water, until one afternoon I felt something pull against the line. The fish wasn't large, but I don't remember caring. I remember holding it and feeling relief because I had been given food before, but this was different. I had found a way to create more. After that, my days developed a rhythm. I checked the water, fished, repaired what needed repairing, watched the clouds, and studied the horizon. I still found myself noticing the currents and weather patterns, partly because watching them was something I had always enjoyed doing. The raft was becoming familiar, and so was the routine. I didn't think of any of this as strength. I was simply doing what needed to be done. I wasn't trying to survive forever. I was trying to survive until someone found me. I don't remember how long I had been on the raft when I saw the first ship. By then, I had become accustomed to searching the horizon while I worked, and at first I thought the dark shape was another trick of distance. When it didn't disappear, I sat up straighter and watched until I could make out the outline of a vessel. I grabbed one of my signals and began waving, shouting as though my voice could somehow cross all that water. For several minutes, I was certain my ordeal was over. I imagined being helped aboard, drinking fresh water without measuring it first, and hearing another person's voice. Instead of turning toward me, the ship continued across the horizon, and I watched until there was nothing left to see. The disappointment hurt, but I told myself something important had happened. Ships traveled through these waters. If one had passed, another would eventually come. The next time, I would be ready. And I was. When another vessel appeared, I had my signals prepared before it came close enough for me to judge its direction. This time, I didn't allow myself to imagine being aboard quite so quickly. I watched for some indication that it had changed course or that someone had noticed me. Nothing changed. Eventually, that ship disappeared too. After that, searching the horizon became different. I still looked, but I began catching myself studying every dark shape and every change in light. Sometimes clouds became ships for a few seconds. A shadow near the horizon could make my heart beat faster before I understood what I was seeing. I had thought hunger would be difficult to manage, but hunger was predictable. Hope wasn't. It could arrive without warning and leave me more exhausted than I had been before. There were other sightings, but one remains clearer than the rest. The ship seemed closer than the others, close enough that I believed someone had to see me. I sat up straighter and signaled until my arms hurt. I shouted even though I knew the distance was probably too great. I watched the vessel and waited for the smallest change in its course. For a while, I convinced myself the ship had changed course, but eventually I had to accept that it was continuing past me. I kept signaling long after I knew it was useless. Eventually, I lowered my arms and watched the ship become smaller. I had missed another chance at rescue, but this time, the disappointment felt different. Until that moment, I had always assumed someone knew I was out there. Maybe they didn't know where I was, but surely they knew there was someone to look for. As the ship disappeared over the horizon, I began to question that for the first time. What if no one knew I had survived the sinking? What if no one was looking for me at all? The ocean hadn't hidden me. I was floating beneath an open sky where anyone could have seen me. Yet I had never felt so invisible. For the first time, I wondered if there was a difference between being lost and being forgotten. For several days after that ship disappeared, I stopped searching the horizon as often. I still looked whenever I checked the weather or noticed something unusual in the distance, but I no longer expected to find a ship waiting there. At first, I thought I had simply become tired of being disappointed. Then, I began to understand that something else had changed. I could keep hoping someone would find me, but I could no longer build my survival around that possibility. That realization should have frightened me more than it did, but instead, I felt strangely calm. I still wanted someone to come, and I would signal any ship or aircraft I saw, but whether they came was beyond my control. The water I collected, the fish I caught, and the condition of the raft were not. For months, I had treated those things as ways to stay alive until rescue arrived. Now, I began to see them differently. They were the reasons I was still alive at all. I started paying closer attention to the ocean. Before the sinking, I had enjoyed watching currents and weather because I liked trying to understand how the sea behaved. On the raft, I had continued watching, mostly out of habit. Now I began asking what those patterns could tell me. I noticed the direction of the current and how it changed after storms. I watched the clouds and the direction of the wind. Birds interested me most. A bird appearing far offshore meant little, but when I began seeing them more frequently, I wondered where they went when they disappeared each evening. For the first time since the sinking, I wasn't looking across the water for someone, I was looking for information. It gave my days a different purpose. I continued fishing and collecting rainwater, but I also began keeping track of what I observed. Without instruments, I couldn't know exactly where the current was carrying me, and the paddles on the raft were never going to devour the Atlantic. I paid attention to whether the birds were becoming more frequent, examined the vegetation that floated past, and watched for changes in the water that might tell me something about where the ocean was taking me. None of those things proved land was nearby, but together they gave me something I hadn't had for a long time: a direction for my thoughts. One morning, while repairing my fishing line, I realized how different I was from the man who had first climbed onto the raft. Back then, every problem had seemed temporary because I believed someone else would eventually arrive to solve the larger one. But no one had collected my rainwater, made my fishing hook, or shown me how to stretch my provisions. Whenever something went wrong, I had somehow found a way to keep going. I had spent months waiting to be rescued without realizing I had been rescuing myself the entire time. That didn't make the ocean smaller, and it didn't guarantee I would reach land. But it changed what I expected from myself. I stopped measuring a good day by whether a ship appeared. A good day became one in which I found food, collected water, repaired something before it failed, or noticed another sign that might tell me where the ocean was taking me. Every problem I solved made the next one seem a little less impossible. Then the birds began staying. I had seen birds before, but these were appearing more regularly, especially toward the evening. Pieces of vegetation became more common in the water. I couldn't be certain what any of it meant, and after so many disappointments, I had learned not to turn every possibility into a promise. Still, I watched. One morning, there was something along the horizon that didn't move like a ship or disappear like a cloud. I stared at it for a long time before allowing myself to believe what I was seeing. Land. Even then, I didn't celebrate because I had trusted the horizon too many times. I watched throughout the day, expecting the shape to disappear like so many things before it, but it remained. By the next morning, it was clearer, and I finally allowed myself to believe that what I was seeing was real. For months, I had searched that horizon, hoping someone would come and take me home. Now, looking at the coastline ahead of me, I understood something I couldn't have understood when this began. The day I stopped waiting to be rescued was the day I began finding my own way home. That was many years ago. I eventually made my home in Central America, not far from the water. And after years of working in other people's kitchens, I opened a restaurant of my own. People sometimes find it strange that I chose a place overlooking the sea. They assume that after everything that happened, I would want to live as far from the ocean as possible. I never felt that way. Most mornings, before the restaurant opens, I take a cup of coffee outside and look across the water. I still notice the clouds, the wind, and the movement of the sea, just as I did when I was a steward aboard that merchant ship. Sometimes I think about the man I was then. I wanted to take a more active role in my own life, but I was used to letting other people make the important decisions, trusting their judgment more than I trusted my own. For a long time, I believed those months on the raft had made me stronger. As I've grown older, I've come to understand it differently. The strength was already there. I simply hadn't learned to trust it. For 133 days, I thought I was learning how to survive. But what I was really learning was how to depend on myself through whatever came next. The ocean didn't teach me how to survive, it showed me that I always could. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please leave a comment and consider subscribing to Mr. Wick and Whispers. Some places don't let you leave completely.